Thank you for watching. My name is Glen Morgan, and this is We the Govern. And today's video is just really digging into just the final days here of the 2025 legislative session as it just limps along into the really we're into the final week. Now I say days because we are a little dazed and confused as the legislature just can't seem to get its act together, and they really only have one mandatory job, which is essentially to get the budget completed, and that is a difficult task at the best of times. And right now, it is not the best of times, and we don't have the highest quality of people in Olympia. So this level of incompetence and chaos that we see kind of unfolding in Olympia, unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be getting better. And might as well do a video about it and explain where the chaos really has led us. So we are a little dazed and confused in Olympia today. Now, before you get too dazed and confused, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button down below. And feel free to share this video with everybody you know if they want to know about what's going on in Olympia and how our political class seems to want to abuse us at all times. Please feel free to make sure they subscribe to this channel so that they can know more. Now, what we're really talking about here, and this is Representative Fitz Gibbons on the House side. He's, of course, a Democrat out of Seattle. And one of the things is he's continually been making these speeches on the House floor saying, we have this budget shortfall. We need more money because, of course, they want more taxes. So he always wants and he's not alone, to be fair. Most of the people in his caucus, the Democrat caucus in both houses, they are desperate to grab as much cash as they possibly can. But what do they mean when they say they need to close this deficit or the shortfall? Well, what they're really just talking about here is the last biennium in Washington State is a 2-year biennium, which means the budget essentially applies to 2 years, which is consistent with the legislative session. $72 billion, which is approximately it's actually approximately 100% larger than it was 10 years ago. So over the last 10 years, this budget has doubled. Of course, the quality of government certainly hasn't improved that much, but that's what's happened with your money as they've been burning it up in Olympia. And this is what he means by a deficit. Basically, the budget proposal currently that the Democrats are looking at right now is an $80 billion budget, and they're considering that a cut in the budget. So this basically an $8 billion increase, and of course then the biennium after that they're saying it's going to go up to $88 billion. This is an unsustainable budget. It's impossible to probably get there, and they don't want to accept the fact that the exceptional growth that's been going on in Washington State since about 2009 or so, that stopped, because there's not very fun when the music stops and there's not enough chairs, and they're going to have to decide on budget cuts, and that's the last thing they want to do. And so basically what he's saying is that this right here, this is what they call a cut in Washington State. So in Olympia, as Representative Fitz Gibbons says, that's what he calls a budget cut. And unfortunately, he's not alone, but it's obviously not honest, and it just misrepresents everything. But what's really happened here, essentially we're in a scenario where in Washington State, just like Washington, D.C., just like many other states around the country, government can just never get enough taxes. It doesn't matter how much money you give them, they will waste every penny of it and then always need more. And so the challenge for the political class is that they're trying to figure out how to get more of your tax dollars. Now, the origin of the specific situation that we are facing in Washington State really goes back to Governor Inslee's administration here, where basically he kind of left a nice little Easter egg surprise for Bob Ferguson. Now, it was no surprise. It was actually something that Inslee negotiated on his way out the door, knowing that under the Inslee administration, he was never going to have to face the music for basically giving a massive beyond the grave, or basically his legislative term, reaching into the next legislative term where Bob Ferguson is occupying the governor's mansion, and ensuring that his little Easter egg, Inslee's little Easter egg, just lands in Bob Ferguson's lap, and those of us who are here having to deal with the problem. And essentially what this came down to is a massive public sector union, big, giant, bloated pay raise, the negotiations of which, of course, occurred behind closed doors after these unions here gave just a ton of money to the Democrats and helped them in their political campaigns. Their payback was to get a massive pay raise, which basically is just that deficit. If the state did nothing else but reverse that pay raise, we wouldn't even have a problem. Now, we still have a problem. We still have bad government, but at least we wouldn't have this bloated multi-billion-dollar expansion of government that's being called a pay cut, or I should say downsizing government, or some other ridiculous excuse that we're getting in Olympia, depending on how they want to refer to it. And this is the deal. I mean, the unions just simply pass on not just the obvious campaign contributions, but the essential workforce that's needed to elect some of the worst people Olympia's ever seen in public office. And of course, it's just pennies on the dollar. They can give them some money, they can pay for these campaigns, and there's some expectation that comes from that, which is that they wanted their big fat paycheck, especially from Inslee on the way out the door. And Inslee was happy to give it to him because what did he care? He wasn't going to be in Olympia any longer anyway. And so this is the situation that we find ourselves in. And the Democrats, not just in the Senate and the House, they claimed that they want to be putting people first, but of course that's absolutely not true. The truth is they are absolutely putting the people dead last. They're putting the special interests in Olympia first, but the people are nowhere a part of this equation other than a potential opportunity for them to extract money from the people. And that's essentially what we see going on in Olympia, and it's becoming more and more apparent, especially as we approach these final days. I'm going to say final in air quotes because to me it looks like we're going to be facing a special legislative session. Because what we find with all these proposals coming out of Olympia right now, and again, none of these tax proposals have passed yet. There's been this churn. It's been going on all over the place, and they've had all kinds of ideas of how they can come and get you in the way of extracting some of the money out of your pocket. This is really what they've been doing in Olympia, and this is the most of the behind-the-scenes negotiations. The Republicans haven't been part of this discussion because the Republicans have not a significant majority, and they're a minority in both houses, and essentially the Democrats have not quite, they're basically a supermajority in both houses, so they get to do what they want. Now they are influenced a bit by the Republicans, and the Republicans have made some strides in stopping some of the worst of the excesses. But essentially what you're seeing is that this is what the Democrats are doing. They're pushing hard to get more of your money so that they can destroy it and waste it just like they do every year. The problem, of course, is that some of these tax increases are pretty large. And what are we getting for the money? Well, the largest share of our money, largest single pot that it goes into, is public education, run here by Chris Reichel himself, who's really got the unique distinction of getting more money than anybody has ever received in the history of Washington State in any measurable way, by student, per capita, adjusted for inflation. It's the largest amount of money ever dumped into public education, and he has produced the worst results that anybody in that position has ever done, with some of the lowest test scores ever recorded in Washington for both math and literacy tests. And unfortunately, those standards just seem to keep getting worse and worse. I mean, these are the scores that are being, saying that 70% of the kids can't do math. That's with them cooking the books, making it look better than it actually is. And at the same time, because Chris Reichel hasn't been satisfied just with that, even though so much money has been coming into public education, he's also declared war on girls' sports and taken just a lot of oddball. I mean, one of his lowest priorities is trying to actually educate kids based on his public conversations on the subject. It's all been about kicking money over to the Washington Education Association and, like I said, destroying girls' sports and other esoteric and things that have nothing to do with improving the education of kids. And that's what you're paying for with every tax increase that gets there. On top of that, nobody's been willing in Olympia to actually start cutting off this nonprofit boondoggle associated with these grants that come out of just every porous entity that exists in the state government, whether it's Department of Commerce kickback grants, whether it's ecology kickback grants, or whether it's Fish and Wildlife, Enviro kickback scams, the homeless industrial complex, every single low-income housing, which is essentially a front for the low-income housing, which is essentially basically the homeless industrial complex pretending to actually stick everybody who's a drug addict behind scenes. You can't see him in the tents on the street. these just continue to proliferate with billions of dollars being distributed there, and the state refuses to cut that off. What they're trying to do is, of course, extract more of your cash. On top of that, one of their biggest priorities this year was to take a concept that has failed every time in human history that's ever been applied, which is rent control. And in order to do that, they had to take people like Senator Alvarado here, which I've discussed in previous videos and in my ethics complaint on the subject, where she's essentially working for one of these grifting operations, and in exchange for getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars there, exempting them from the very rules of rent control that she says she actually thinks is a good idea, and in only imposing that rent control on the opposition, which is unethical, even in Washington state. And this is their big marquee achievement, something that even Argentina recently realized after 80 years of experiments, that they dropped rent control just last year, and rent dropped everywhere in the country. And why did that happen? Because every time rent control is used, it always jacks up the cost of rent in the end, and it saves nobody anything. Of course, it does help people if you are her employer and you happen to be able to destroy your competition along the way. Now, this is the best that they've been able to deliver. Now, I've talked about Bob Ferguson rejecting some of the more extreme elements of the Democrat legislature's campaign agenda items, including a number of taxes, which he's come out in marginal opposition against. I mean, he said he's not going to sign it. That doesn't mean that he's promised that he won't veto it. And in Washington state, if the governor doesn't sign it, we don't have a pocket veto like they do in D.C. In our state, if the governor doesn't sign it, it becomes law on its own. Now, he can pretend later on to say that he didn't sign the bill, but it still could become law. So I want to point those kind of weasel words out there, because Ferguson's not saying that he's absolutely going to veto it. Now, his opposition to some of these dumb tax ideas, that's been good. It's been unexpected, and many people are surprised. But the Democrats in the legislature, of course, were so angry about it, they wouldn't let Ferguson's staff have access to either the caucus rooms in the Senate or the House. And on top of that, they decided to basically attack his staff until his policy staff, most of them have actually left and quit. So this is kind of the internal intramural kind of fighting that's going on the Democrat side, and Bob Ferguson's been right in the middle of it, but I don't think you can count on him to necessarily stop some of the craziness. Every little dumb tax idea is essentially still on the table, and it's just as unappetizing as it was when these concepts were first presented to us in the leaked emails from a number of months ago, which I did a video on that at the time. So let's discuss some of these. Now, I should correct myself. Not every single tax is still on the table. The dating app tax, which is one of the weirder ones that have been proposed in some of the earlier drafts in the Democrat Party, that one appears to actually be gone now. Now, there was a theory and a rumor floating around that several of the Democrat legislators had used these dating apps and had bad experiences with them, and so they thought, why not go and punish them and add a tax to it, because after all, their personal experiences with those dating apps was bad, so let's try to tax them. Apparently, it was so widely ridiculed that that one actually did finally appear to disappear from the tax meal that they were trying to serve us. But let's look at some of the ones that technically are still out there right now. They really haven't completely gone away. If you look at Senate Bill 5797, which is actually scheduled to be voted on in the Senate right now, this is the dumb idea that seems to disappear, it goes away, and they're trying to come back up with it, which is this idea of taxing unrealized, unimaginary, non-existent gains, and nobody else does that in the world. It's a terrible idea. It's been experimented with before and failed every time, and it exists primarily as some kind of fever dream imagination where somehow the people proposing this idea think that those who actually have enough assets to have a tangible amount of money that they would actually pay on this terrible tax idea that nobody knows for sure how it would work, that they wouldn't just simply declare the domicile somewhere outside of Washington state, which they can do with little hassle if they have that kind of money, and essentially then the imaginary tax income that they think they're going to get from this, that actually disappears just as much as this imaginary tax scheme would be. And yet, they're still considering it, even though everybody's roundly mocked this, everybody realizes it doesn't work, even Bob Ferguson's come out and said that it's delusional, it doesn't matter, it still exists. They're still fighting and pushing paper in Olympia, kind of moving this thing along, at least on the Senate side, and this is really where we're at on just another terribly unappetizing tax on top of that one that's been proposed. And this is just a classic example of this kind of, cornucopia cornucopia of really rotten ideas that they're proposing to us. And this one has to do with HB, it's 2084 out of the House side of the legislative equation in Olympia, that's trying to tax storage units, which is essentially a tax on the poor. If anybody's actually used a storage unit before, you'll know that wealthy people tend to not use those. It's mostly something that where a place where you keep your stuff while you're making a transition in life. But of course, declaring war on the poor has been something the Democrats have done in Olympia for a long, long time, and this is just part of that equation. On top of that, they want to tax gold and silver. I mean, why not? Let's just find a way to tax everything you possibly can. Dumb bill idea. Won't make the money they claim it is. And instead, what it'll do is it'll, of course, put businesses just out of business, little businesses that actually provide some of these services for no benefit to the consumer except to increase the cost of living in Washington state. But of course, that's not the only one. On top of that, this House Bill 2043 has actually been, this is a 9-cent gas tax that's been proposed. Now, they were going to start out at 6, move it up to 9. There's a variety of different versions on this. And mainly it's because nobody's been more incompetent with how they waste your tax dollars on transportation issues than Washington state. Diverting mass volumes of your tax dollars into the Columbia River Bridge crossing that, of course, has just turned into a boondoggle from inception. Even though it was killed at one time, the CRC project killed a number of years ago, it's been resurrected primarily as a way to reward Portland's failing and bankrupt light rail program, the TriMet program. So trying to bring the red light rail, I should say, across the bridge from Portland, just barely a mile into Washington state, so that Oregon can essentially screw over the taxpayers of Washington and get them to pay for that failing light rail system in Oregon. So that's an example of how your tax dollars are wasted. They also squander, our Department of Transportation has been squandering money on mitigation schemes, overpriced projects, doing anything except for actually dealing with congestion or repairing bridges. And of course, now that we see this problem coming, the only solution, rather than going back and actually correct some of the priorities of the Department of Transportation, is to propose this large tax increase. On top of the CCA tax increase that's already occurred and other historic tax increases, this is another one. It's still, now this is not as far down it's still in committee last I checked, at least the time I'm recording this video. But bad ideas, and they're not alone. They're coming up with trying to resurrect things that we thought were killed just a few weeks ago. The Democrats just seem bound and determined to try to do this. And everywhere you look as you're going through this whole process here, there doesn't seem to be any effort to get away from what the Seattle Chamber of Commerce called Washington State's kamikaze economic policies. And this is generating a lot of angst and concern from those who actually have the ability to do math and recognize that there's no upside to any of these tax proposals that Olympia is looking at right now. But our legislators are absolutely just completely refusing to cut the bloat in a government that exists right now, starting with this inflated kind of poison pill, a negotiated tactic that Inslee had last year. That one, addressing that one issue and just saying, listen, we will not give bloated pay raises to state workers. We're actually going to keep them at the same level that they've been at the last couple of years. Instead, they're looking at things like furloughs, on top of tax increases. So they want to make the state workers even less efficient than they already are, and indirectly giving them sort of a pay cut a little bit, but not really saving much money, just going through this kabuki dance over it. And at the same time, increase taxes that won't bring in as much money as they're projecting, but will absolutely hurt the people that the legislators supposedly are representing out there in our state. Now, not all is bad news. Some of the rest elements around Washington state, there are elements of our governments and local governments that are starting to recognize reality. And I did the story here last week, and Jonathan Cho did the story about WSU instructor Patrick Mahoney, who had been clearly violently attacking a student for wearing a MAGA hat. And after those videos and story went public last week, it looks like Washington State University did indeed fire this instructor from their staff, and also his co-conspirator, the other WSU hourly paid employee who was joined in on the assault. Both of them have been fired from Washington State University right now, which is a recognition of reality. Instead of just stonewalling and keeping them on the payroll, they've decided to get rid of them. That was a move in the right direction. Now, part of it's probably because Washington State University right now, they do face at least a 15% budget cut amid financial struggles, partially because they're getting a lot fewer students that are attending the school, and partially because there's just less money coming in general. And this is before some of the federal cuts and grants that seem to be inevitable that'll also be coming to this university. So there does seem to be some rational recognition, even in places like Washington State University. Not just there, even Western's recognizing that they have to lay off teachers and staff, probably less the professors there. And to my knowledge, none of these professors have gone out and assaulted students yet. But that's an $18 million cut that they have to deal with right now. And I'm sure it won't get better as time moves forward. But at least they're trying to face up to the reality that the economic reality that's facing them. I mean, even in a place like Seattle, and you can read about this right now, they have a $241 million revenue shortfall in Seattle. Essentially, their unrealistic expectations for their absurd tax increases suddenly didn't produce the money that they had been promised, and that money's going away in part because businesses that do have the ability to do math, unlike the city council, generally they just moved across the river in most cases, because why pay stupid taxes in Seattle for a lower quality of life when you can run your business right across the bridge in basically Bellevue or Kirkland or Redmond, and do far better than you ever would if you were in Seattle. So the shortfall's causing Seattle to actually have to cut back as well. So there's some recognition around the state, even in delusional pockets of craziness like Seattle, that money just doesn't exist forever to be thrown out there and wasted. They've wasted everything they could, and now they're facing the outcome of that waste and the destructive policies that they've implemented, and they're having to make cuts in these jurisdictions. But of course, if you are a legislator in Olympia and you're a Democrat, because let's be fair here right now, there's a very clear division. The Republicans have been resisting the tax increases in a pretty unusually unified message, and been trying to promote various tax decreasing how some of the tax dollars are wasted. And it's been very stubborn Democrats that are absolutely refusing to cut any of the bloat in government. And so this is an important thing to remember. I think it's fairly inevitable that we're going to see a special session in Olympia. What this means is that because the legislature can't get and finish their sole job, their sole required job, which is a budget, if they can't get that done in the next few days, then essentially they're going to be required to go back and do a special session. Normally in the past, it's been the governor that calls these special sessions, but I think this time the legislature is going to have to probably call it themselves and come back for another 30 days to try to resolve what they should have been able to do in the first 90 days that they were in Olympia. And that means that it's going to be 30 more days of chaos and dazed and confused experiences as these legislators inevitably probably are going to have to face up to the fact that there are going to have to be some real cuts that they have to come to, and that all of their dreams and schemes around these taxes are not going to materialize, not in the way that they think they will. But regardless of this, I think it's very important for you and I and many others in our state who actually care about the reality of what we're facing and want to wake up our political class, that it's probably incumbent on us to help them identify waste and problems and programs that could be cut in our state. And one way of doing that is learning the budget, paying attention to where these grants actually go, and doing your research on the money. Always follow the money. And that's kind of the first rule when I'm doing Doge Washington classes all over Washington State right now. You can find them on my website. I'll link to them down below. There's lots of those going on. You have an opportunity to go there and learn how to follow the money and dig up information, and you might be able to provide information to your legislator, explaining to them where there are great opportunities to cut fraud, waste, and abuse all over Washington State, dumb programs and incompetent programs, and that might actually help them close their perceived budget gap if they seem to be unable to do it themselves. A little bit of help from you and I might go a long ways. But no matter what, we have to keep being engaged. We have to be willing to expose the truth. In order to do that, you have to be willing to show up, because in the end, the future belongs to those who show up.